Okay, folks, we're going to finish up with chapter 20, looking at late medieval and early Renaissance Northern Europe. If you recall, the dates for this are from 1395 to 1500, and we talked about the Flemish painters, the Flemish artists in the last video. We ended with them. Those were the early Flemish painters, so keep that in mind. And we're going to begin this one with the late Flemish painters coming out of Flanders, and the time that we're looking at here in particular is around 1450 to 1475. And we're gonna discuss one artist in particular during this time, and then we're going to jump to the Holy Roman Empire and what the artwork looks like there in regards to again this early Renaissance, late medieval time in Europe, Northern Europe in particular. Okay, so I want you to get to figure 20.15, and it's Bout's altarpiece of the Holy Sacrament in St. Peter's in Belgium. And remember, the Belgium area is where Flanders was. So that little, if you go back to the map 20.1, it will show you a little sliver of kind of darker brown in between the Holy Roman Empire and that of the French ducal courts. And there it will indicate where present Belgium is, even though it wasn't noted then, and where Flanders is, which is up on the coastal line, which made the Flemish very successful in their mercantile exchanges and their maritime trades, which is what brought in a lot of money into this area. So one thing that, again, that the Flemish did and what Flanders came up with was the use of the oil paint. And the use of the oil paint allowed dry time to be very slow so that you could go back in and make any alterations unless you added some kind of solvent to kind of speed up or what's the word I'm looking for? Expedite the drying process or to speed it up. So it was a very slow drying paint and allowed for a lot of workability. Plus, it was very friendly to the brush strokes and allowed for maneuverability. And the third thing that it does is it allows for illumination. So it allows for this trapping of the light that comes in and then reflects it back out. So it makes it very luminous. And what's happening during this early Renaissance period is a shift back to naturalism. It will be heavily focused on humanism whenever we get into the actual Renaissance in chapter 21, but definitely a discussion and interest in naturalism and showing what's going on naturally in the world around you. And by using the oil paint, it allows for that natural illumination in the environment to be reflected in these renderings on these within these paintings. So figure 20.15 is Bout's, again, the altarpiece of the Holy Sacrament. And when looking at this centerpiece in particular that we see in the middle where everybody is around the table focusing on Jesus in the center of the table, this is not a Last Supper, by the way. All right, this is not a Last Supper. A lot of people get this confused with it being the Last Supper whenever he states that one of you will betray me, but that's not what this is. He's actually giving a sacrament. I'll talk about that here in a second. But that environment that he's in and that they're all in, his disciples and his apostles, is again an interior structure of a Flemish home and in Flanders. And we saw that with the early Flemish painters in particular, and how the interior architecture was very important, and then how these biblical parables and tales are being put into these Flemish homes, which is connecting Flanders with the Holy Bible. So by choosing to show these pastimes played out in these Flemish interior homes, the interior of these homes again connects them kind of subliminally to the actions of the biblical scriptures. And another thing that stands out in here that attests to that is if you look in the far back left corner, there's a window, a viewing window up against the back wall, and there's two Flemish patrons, the ones who actually gave the money for this painting to be done, peering into the scene of the Holy Sacrament. So again, it's showing that they are observing the scriptures in the Bible and the holy in these very sacred texts, and they're viewing not only into the understanding and awareness of the pastimes of Jesus, but also they're trying to place themselves in that activity by having them promoted as the patrons in the painting. And that's why they're being depicted back there to the far left, up against the far back wall. Okay? Um, so this is, the last sacrament. This is like prior to the whole discussion about how he is going to be departing from his material body. And so that's the narrative that's going on in the center part of the piece. There's other biblical stories that are being told and unfolded, as well as connections with Flemish activities, again relating the Flemish with the biblical, on the adjacent corners of the central piece. Again, this is a triptych, so you got 3 sections. 5 overall paintings, 5 panels, but it has 3 sections, and 2 of the sections have 2 paintings, 2 panels, and then of course the centerpiece itself. One thing that is happening during this time, and we'll discuss in chapter 21, is a rebirth of linear perspective, trying to show the architecture in hard lines, like 90-degree angle lines, going back towards a horizon, going back to what's called a vanishing point. And what's going to happen is the Italian Renaissance artists are going to, like Leonardo da Vinci, are going to learn how to use oil from the Northern Renaissance painters, okay, who are the Flemish mostly. And then the Northern Renaissance painters are going to learn about linear perspective from the Southern Renaissance painters, like we have Bouts here, learning linear perspective from the Southern Renaissance. And the Southern Renaissance is equated with the Italian Renaissance. So what we're discussing here is the northern element of the Renaissance, and we're going to be talking about the southern or the Italian in the next chapter. Okay, and by using that linear perspective, it builds up what's called spatial recessions, which means that they're showing the space from the foreground, which is the ground in front of you. So if you're looking at the centerpiece of figure 20.15, that would be where the disciples of Jesus have their backs towards us with their chairs and their garments. Okay, that's the foreground. The middle ground is Jesus himself with his followers next to him, and the background is where all the architecture leads towards that horizon. And where this what's called a vanishing point, which is a point where all the lines converge to one point, is actually right at Jesus's head. Okay, so all the architectural lines are leading from the ceiling down. Imagine the lines they continue down towards his head, and all the lines on the tiles with the floor are leading up towards his head. And then all the side lines are leading toward, all the walls to the side are meant to be leading towards his head. So he's the center piece. By using these subliminal and what are called implied lines, it gives emphasis and central emphasis to Jesus in this altarpiece of the Holy Sacrament. Okay, so by using linear perspective, it creates these spatial recessions, and those spatial recessions all lead to the core figure in the center of the painting, that being Jesus. So that's the vanishing point, and I'll spell it out for you. VANISHING, point, like in a point, POINT. Okay, that's called a vanishing point. I know that Jesus' head is that vanishing point where everything indirectly and directly leads to him. There is the use of asymmetry, so not everything is balanced out. There are more figures on Jesus' right than there are on his left, which is something breaking from those old medieval symmetrical desires of representing different figures, balancing out the composition with 2 on one side, on both sides, and then the central figure being flanked by these 2 even or odd arrangements of symmetry. In this case, there are more to his right than his left, so there's a interest in that, what's called asymmetry. So you have the word symmetry and just add the letter A to the beginning. That means that it's overweighted with mass or sheer numbers on one side versus the other, so it's asymmetrical. Again, this is not the actual Last Supper. This is the sacrament. So instead of belts depicting the Last Supper, like we'll see with Da Vinci and the Southern Renaissance or the Italian Renaissance, what most prominent painters are doing during this time, he's showing this Last Sacrament, which is more of a Judea ritual. Okay. Yeah, and again, the Flemish patrons are looking through the window in the back, and it's just showing that money is really prominent and important during this time for the making of these pieces. And know that these altar pieces are going to people's homes, these rich merchants. They're going to their homes, and this is like their movable temple, movable church, where they unfold these altar pieces and worship Jesus through these paintings. So instead of going to a church, if they're at home, they have this altar piece, and it's huge. And they open them. It's a 6 foot by 5 foot. So they open them up, and then that's where they do their worship to Jesus. So there is that aspect on how, again, that money is a big part of how it's not just the church commissioning or the cathedrals commissioning artwork being done. There's now everyday people that are very wealthy because of the trades via the seas that are now able to buy these expensive pieces and keep them in their homes. Okay. Now another thing that the Flemish are doing is what's called, and I'll leave it with this in regards to the late Flemish painters. Excuse me. What's Latin, and it's called horror vacui. That's HORROR, like horror movie. Vacui, VACUII. And that just means filling the space. And that's what the Northern Renaissance painters are going to do, especially more down the road, is they're going to fill the space, and they're going to put all kinds of people and activities going on in one scene. And you can kind of see that starting to ramp up here. The central piece is full of personalities and different folks, the followers of Jesus, Jesus himself, even the patrons, the Flemish patrons in the background. You got a bishop sitting over there to the side, observing as well. So you have all kinds of different personalities present in one painting. We're going to see more of that unfold, and it's going to lead to what's called the Baroque period and Rococo, which is just full ornamentation and excessiveness, if you will. So it's called horror vacui, and it's again just means to fill up the vacuum with people, like have a lot of activity in one vacuum. Okay, if you think about horror movies, there's a lot of action all the time. So that means to like have a lot of high energy action, and then vacui means like within a space or within a vacuum. So fill up the space, essentially, is what it means. All right, so now let's move to the Holy Roman Empire, and what we're going to be looking at here is not only the clergy, but again, wealthy merchants become patrons of the art. And we're going to look at sculpture, and then we're also going to look at graphic arts. Okay, so printmaking. And the sculptures are going to be mostly wood carved altar pieces, and they're going to be derived from the grandiose period of the Gothic. So the Holy Roman Empire is going to take longer to kind of get out of the late medieval period or the Gothic period than kind of everyone else. Just because it's still, connected to that aspect of emotionalism that came from the medieval period to connect people emotionally to the biblical stories instead of rationally. So it's more of an emotional, not less intelligent, but more focused on the heartfelt devotion of the stories and some of the anguish that these prominent figures in the biblical stories have to go through, and less about the rational, equiposed mentality behind it. So we're going to look at, again, this is going to be for the Holy Roman Empire, figure 20.21, and it's going to be Stauf's death and Assumption of the Virgin, which is the center panel of the altarpiece of the Virgin Mary with the wings open. All right, figure 20.21. This is a 9 foot. These are 9 foot tall figures, so that's a really big deal because we weren't seeing figures this size carved in relief since the Greco-Roman period. The Roman period being the last, just following after the Greeks. Okay, and also during the time of the Greeks. So remember, the Republic of Rome's Republic was happening during the time of the height of the Greek Empire, and then that ended up dwindling, and the Roman Empire ramped up. And this altarpiece was actually paid for by the citizens. Okay, so they all rallied together with their monies to have this large altarpiece made and placed within this Church of St. Mary. And it's supposed to depict great piety. And again, it's very emotional, which is derived from that Gothic period. And you can see that with like twisted clothing and sharp and broken pierced forms throughout the composition. So when you look at the fabric, it's very mottled. And remember, we talked about the difference between what's mottled and what's organic. Organic means that the body underneath is activating the fabric, and it's supposed to look organic based off of the anatomy. And mottled means that it has its own pattern on top of the human body. Okay, so it kind of has a mind of its own, if you will. So if you look at it throughout the altarpiece, you can see very emotional and twisted clothing, very sharp and broken lines. Not broken as in cracked lines, but lines that will go one way and then suddenly shift to another angle very quickly. All right, and this is something again derived and coming out of that medieval period. What's really interesting about this is we're starting to see a combination of architecture, sculpture, and painting all at once. Okay, so you have the architecture within the wood carving that will continue into the overall architecture in the Church of St. Mary. So where the wood altarpiece ends, the actual stone architecture will begin. So it's incorporating that. So it looks like there's this continuum. And then also the sculptural aspect itself, the fact that these figures are almost 9 feet tall. So that gives you an idea how big this altarpiece is. You can see in the description it's 23 feet tall. So the image doesn't give justice at all to the actual size of this piece. And in the painting, we see paint and gilding. We see a combination of bright paints, which is actually how a lot of sculptures were painted at this time. And the exterior sculptures that had this paint on them had just weathered away over time. But here, with this altarpiece being interior with not a lot of light on it, the paint and the gilded, which is the gold gilded surface, has remained over time since around 1477 to 1489, which is when this was made. And that means it took 12 years for this altarpiece to be constructed. This isn't artwork that just happens overnight. It took 12 years for it to be finished. This is rare to see. That's why I'm showing it to you. The fact that it still has the paint in the gilded surface, it's very rare. If you look at a lot of the work that we've looked at sculpturally, it doesn't have a lot of paint on it because this is a rare preservation. We don't typically see this today over time from the time period that they're made, because a lot of the paint has been rubbed off or destroyed or carved off. And here we actually see it preserved. So this is a very rare, very, very, very rare example. Okay. So sculpture during the Holy Roman Empire was really these large wooden altarpieces. And then also during this time, we're going to see the use of printmaking. And printmaking started with wood cut blocks, so cutting into pieces of wood, and your imagery is going to be the reverse. So however you run a piece of paper over a roller with ink that's been laid inside of the wood will be a reverse image. So if you want to have your name on a piece of paper from the printmaking process, you have to carve it in reverse. So Greg would have to, that's my first name, would have to look like, the way I'm facing it is how it would look if I was showing it up to a mirror, so that if I held it up to a mirror, I could read it in the mirror correctly, Greg. But I have to do backwards G, E, R, backwards G, and all those letters would have to be backwards and run G-E-R-G, carved into the wood. And then when I run the paper and the ink into the wood and then the paper on top and then roll a roller over it, flip it over, then it will read properly G-R-E-G. So that's how printmaking works. And a lot of it was wood cuts, which just means that you're cutting into wood, transferring the imagery over onto a piece of paper. And you would cut into the wood, and then you would get the ink inside of the wood that you remove. So where you want the image to be black on the piece of paper, you would put the ink into that recessed area. And then where you want it white or grayish white, you don't put any ink there. You wipe it away. When the ink's still wet, you push that paper with a roller into that wood grain, pull the wood away, and then it will transfer over. It's called image transferring. This is a time when movable text with images were on a high because literacy was on an increase. We'll talk about with the Italians. They create a whole new form of vernacular altogether, getting people more read and getting people more literate. So the printing press was starting to come alive. The manuscripts had a combination, the biblical manuscripts had a combination of images as well as that of the text, of course, coming from the Bible. So there's a combination of the two to get people on board with the imagery, which is coming from a medieval emotional time, with the rational text and the vernacular and the literature as people were becoming more and more educated and more well read. So that was on the increase. The literacy was on an increase. So the demand for this printmaking images with words was really starting to be on the rise. So what we're going to look at is a new advent from Chaugier, Saint Anthony tormented by demons, and it's figure 20.24. And this is actually called an engraving, which is going to be a whole new technique altogether of printmaking from the woodcut technique. And what they're using is metal. They're engraving and etching into metal, and you get different types of lines based off of how much you cut into the metal. If you cut into the metal heavily, then you get really deep, dark lines. And if you just scratch the surface of the metal, you're going to get more texturized and subtle lines. So once you cut your image in reverse on a plate of metal, carving into it with a sharper tool that cuts that soft metal properly, then again you roll ink over the top of that plate, then you lay your piece of paper over the top of that plate, roll it with a heavy stone, and then once you roll that roller out of the way, it will transfer over and it will look like figure 20.4, St. Anthony tormented by demons. And if you look at this, you can see with St. Anthony, he's starting to become more rational. He doesn't have this bothered aspect about him. He's holding firm in his logic and in his rationality. Even though he has these 5 or 6 different demoniac figures coming in on him and pulling at his beard, pulling at his hair, pulling at his clothes, and trying to torment and torture him, but he's unaffected, which is a sign that we're moving into this Renaissance period where you're supposed to be more equiposed and less affected by these exterior characters or interior characters at that. So you can see that we're starting to move into this new wave of thinking whenever it comes to artwork. And this is one of the first that we see. This is a precursor to that. So we have the movement into the Renaissance happening here by seeing this equiposed, non-tormented figure. Even though they're trying to torment him, he doesn't seem to express that very much. We're also moving away from that woodcut printmaking technique and moving into metal engraving. Again, thick and thin line, or thin and thick lines are incised into the metal. And what this does is it shows a different variety of lines. It also does a few other things. It creates value. And a value is a shift between a dark to a light. And all of that grayscale in between is called a value shift. And then when you add color to that value, it's called a saturation. And in this case, it's just value because it's black to white. and that grayscale in between is showing a value. And then all the different varieties of lines actually are creating what's called texture. So it's adding texture. And if you look at those creatures, there's a lot of texture to them because he's really trying to emphasize the tormented aspects of those creatures by building up a lot of texture. Yeah. Oh, one thing real quick, and I'll talk about this more in chapter 21, is these Northern Renaissance painters, when they started using this printmaking technique, are more interested in what's called cross-hatching versus their southern counterparts in Italy. They use more parallel lines to create value and texture. Here they use like two perpendicular lines would be called cross-hatching, and then two parallel lines next to each other would be called parallel hatching. So instead of building up lines like on top of one another in parallel scale, they like to cross hatch. And the more tight the mesh on the cross hatching, the more dark it's going to be. And then the more open it is, the more light there's going to be. Okay, so you have the lines to play with, and then also how the lines either overlap with the Northern Renaissance printmakers and painters, or how the lines are different and how they run next to each other, which we'll see with which is called parallel hatching, which we'll see with the Italian Renaissance painters and printmakers. Okay, I'll leave you at that, and we'll get to chapter 21 very soon.